I see that we have very helpful audience members who are pointing out where there are open seats. So please come on in, find a seat. We'll wait a few moments until everyone gets settled before we begin.
Not disturbing. Sorry? No, that's fine. Oh, you're taking movies?
Like a flower.
How long will that shoot? An hour?
An hour and a half on each card.
Wow.
So
All right, well, welcome everyone, and good evening. Once again, my name is Angela Kelly, and I'd actually like to start by thanking you, Joseph Gerson, as Joseph acknowledged many of the co-sponsoring groups and individuals who made this evening possible. I think we should also recognize his leadership. His vision, as you know, we did start talking about this almost a year ago now, wondering what this new moment would be, but he had this vision that we must come together at this pivotal time as we confront both new possibilities and worsening crises before us. So the theme of this evening's panel is the challenge before us, of which there are many, and they are both complicated and interrelated, as Joseph pointed out in his welcome. So as we look ahead to the ways we can confront the intersecting challenges before us, and as we strive to find new ways and new strategies for renewing and expanding our activism in these uncertain times, we are very fortunate to have two extremely eminent and esteemed leaders here to guide our thinking as we kick off this conference this evening. But before we get into our keynote panelist remarks, which I know we are all very eagerly awaiting, just a few practical announcements. It seems like we must be doing all set for seating. If there's anyone else in the hallway, please do come in and find a seat. There's seats in front, back. People will, folks in the audience will continue to help guide stray folks in. Just want to remind everyone or announce, if you haven't seen in your program yet, that after the panel this evening there will be 3 breakout sessions where we will have the chance to go deeper into the issues raised by our speakers this evening. And it will also be a chance in the breakout sessions to continue to build and strengthen the relationships among us, which we know are really what's key to sustaining our movements and alliances going forward. So just to be thinking about it as you're listening to the speakers, the topics and locations for these breakout groups are in your packet if you have one, but if you don't, there will be a group focused on processing this panel discussion. I'm sure we'll have a very rich and intense conversation with our speakers, and that group will stay right here in room 104. There will also be a group focused on organizing, on how we translate what we hear tonight into strategies for action, and that conversation will happen in room 112, which is down the hall in this direction, to my left and your right. And finally, there will be a third group focused on Obama, the Obama era, how we engage the Obama administration, the movement that put him into office. And that group will be meeting down the hallway in this direction, to my right and your left, in Pearson 106. So please do stay and join us for those discussions so that we can continue these vital conversations. And please join us tomorrow as well for the full day. We'll be starting with refreshments and tabling and registration at 8 a.m. in Cabot Hall, which is at 170 Packard Avenue. It's at the top of the hill. I also want to let any students or young activists who are here know, if you haven't heard, you're invited to come back again on Sunday morning between 9:30 and 10:30. We'll have a brunch followed by a session with Tom Hayden and some organizing and strategizing specifically for students and young activists. So if you can't come all day tomorrow, please do feel welcome to come back on Sunday morning, and that will also be in Cabot Auditorium. And finally, I'd just like to call your attention to a few of the many great materials in your packets if you have one tonight, and if not, you'll get one tomorrow. As Joseph mentioned, it's very timely that we are meeting here today after hearing the announcement of President Obama's policy and plans for Afghanistan, which are certainly troubling for many of us in the peace movement who want to see that occupation also ended, as we know there continues to be great suffering for Americans, for the Afghan people, for the world community, and for the global economy. For each day, these wars go on and on. So please do take a look at the call for national action for peace in Afghanistan in your packet. We're encouraging calls to the White House. The comment line is on there. We're also encouraging folks to march with many of us within United for Justice and Peace, AFSC. Many of the co-sponsoring organizations are also endorsers of the march next weekend on April 4th in New York City, the theme of which is Beyond War, a New Economy is Possible, so a way to link together many of the issues on our mind, just as we will do this weekend. And there's also a call for local actions for peace in Afghanistan, April 6th and 9th. And I know some folks in the room are already working on setting up lobby visits and events locally, so please do check that out. And there is also a flyer with more information on the rally next Saturday and how you can get tickets for that. So we said we're going to have rich conversations tonight, but we want to move forward, taking action. So these are a few concrete ways you can do that in the coming days. So now we can turn our attention to what I'm sure you've all been waiting for, the remarks by our very special guests, Noam Chomsky and Bill Fletcher Jr., both of whom have contributed so much to our movements over the years. Each panelist will have a little over half an hour to share his thoughts on the challenges before us, and then we should have some time for Q&A and discussion. So first, it is my great honor to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky. So he probably doesn't need much of an introduction in this crowd. He certainly deserves one. Professor Chomsky is a longtime intellectual leader, speaker, author, and activist whose work has been vital to many social and political movements over the last several decades. He is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT and the author of numerous best-selling political works. His latest books are Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy, and What We Say Goes. And a book about him, The Essential Chomsky, edited by Anthony Arnaud, is a new collection of his writings from the 1950s to the present, and that was just published last year. So we welcome and thank you, Professor Chomsky.
How's that? Okay. Well, the overall title for the conference is so broad that I was quite puzzled about how to get started, but as usual, the morning papers had it fit. So the lead story, as you heard, was that President Obama announced his new Afghan policy, actually what's called AFPAC policy, Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's actually a good name. The distinction between Afghanistan and Pakistan is imposed by British imperial power, what's called the Durand Line, which cuts right through the Pashtun territories, the most troubled regions. And the people there have never accepted it. They don't accept British imperial decisions. The Afghan government, as long as it was functioning up through the 70s, never accepted it. So we'll call it AFPAC, like Obama. The new policy, as you know, the new announcement is to send 4,000 additional troops in addition to the 17,000 already determined to be sent there. There was a little item, if you searched, from the Pakistani foreign minister saying, please don't bomb anymore, but that's not very interesting. So there's also a decision to increase the bombing, the drones, the unmanned bombers, and they have effects. So one of the most troubled regions where there's been a lot of fighting going on is Bajaur province, on what's called the Pakistani side of the Durand Line. Local militants there have told the press that the fighting was largely motivated by a drone bombing, which I don't think was even reported here. It was reported in the Pakistani press. A drone hit a madrasa, a school, killed some 80 to 85 people. And these are what Winston Churchill called uncivilized tribes. They don't understand our high moral and cultural level, and they get upset by things like that. So it started a reaction which blew up into a big war. And every one of the drone attacks has that effect. Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, his first message to Obama was a plea to stop the attacks on Afghan civilians. He also called for a deadline for withdrawal of all foreign troops. He even went on and said that he wants negotiations among all Afghans. He's said that he would be glad to welcome Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, who's an Afghan, for discussions about how to terminate the conflict. And he said that if the U.S. doesn't like that, they'll have a choice of either accepting it or throwing him out. Well, the second choice is the one that was made. As soon as Karzai was very popular, remember, a lot of awe about his wonderful costume and how he looked and so on. But that's shifted. Now, after these breaches of discipline, his image changed sharply. He's condemned as corrupt, ineffective, and so on. We have to do something about it. And what's being done about it is what you'd expect. Britain and the United States agreed to replace it. They can't formally do it, but they're going to restructure Afghanistan, which is, of course, our right, so that a new administrative officer will be introduced who will theoretically take responsibility, meaning take orders from us. And Karzai can be a symbolic figure. I don't think his letter to Obama was ever answered except by more attacks. Is there another possibility? Yeah, there are other possibilities. I mean, there's an Afghan peace movement, a substantial one, which for years has been calling for an end to the violence. Put down your guns. If you want to be here, fine, but come with aid and reconstruction. Exactly the scale is not known, but Western polls taken out in Afghanistan indicate that about 75% of the population want negotiation among Afghans. That means all Afghans. And they want to settle their own affairs, have a communal assembly, dear God, devoted to peace, and if the foreigners are there, they should be there for aid and reconstruction, not for killing. We don't know the numbers. The Washington Post, one of the few comments on it, their corresponding Pamela Constable said that one of the big problems the U.S. forces, the new forces, are going to face when they get to Afghanistan, of course, one of the problems will be insurgency. The other problem will be they're not wanted. And they'll have to somehow deal with this tricky issue. Karzai is not super popular. His popularity runs about 50% according to Western polls, but that's almost twice as high as the popularity of the Western forces, the American forces there. So that's another technical difficulty that has to be dealt with. Another aspect of the escalated attack in AFPAC is the consequences of which could be extremely grim for Pakistan as well as Afghanistan. Another aspect is that NATO, as you know, is being encouraged to take a bigger role in this, which raises interesting questions like why does NATO exist? I mean, it's a pretty simple question. I mean, there was a theoretical reason up until about 1990. Whether you believe it or not is another question, but it was claimed that it existed as a defensive alliance to protect Western Europe from being overrun by the Mongols directed in Moscow. Okay, maybe not, but whatever one thinks of that argument, it was gone by the time that the Soviet system collapsed. At that time, Gorbachev, Prime Minister Gorbachev, made an astonishing concession to the West. he agreed to allow a united Germany to join, and of course a militarized Germany, to join a NATO, hostile military alliance. And that's pretty remarkable when you consider that Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia twice in the past century, and now it was going to be allowed to join a major military alliance targeting Russia and led by the world's most awesome superpower in history, which is very hostile. But he did insist on a condition. This was the Bush #1 administration, Bush-Baker. The condition was that, and it was accepted by Bush and Baker, that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the formulation. That would give Russia some kind of a buffer zone. He also made a proposal that there should be a nuclear weapons-free zone from the Arctic to the Baltic, which would also be a way of easing potential tensions. As far as I know, that never even got a response, kind of like Karzai's plea to stop killing us. So that was rejected, but Bush and Baker did agree, pledge not to extend NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, Bill Clinton won the next election. One of his first acts was to extend NATO to the east. A very threatening act to the Russians. And of course it increased tensions and hostility. Russia dropped its pledge, no first use pledge, no first use of nuclear weapons. NATO has never dropped the pledge, but Russia had dropped it, they reinstated it, and rearmament, development of offensive weapons, of course, continued. All of that escalated sharply under Bush. Same aggressive militarism leads to that natural response, makes the world more dangerous. Well, Obama's national security advisor, James Jones, former Marine commandant, is a leading exponent of the idea that NATO should expand farther to the east and to the south. De Hoop Scheffer, the Dutch head of NATO, has explained that NATO must become an intervention force to protect pipelines and sea lanes, in other words, to ensure that Europe and the United States have control of the world's energy system. And that's what we can anticipate. As you probably know, there's major demonstrations next week in Strasbourg protesting NATO's expansion, in fact, NATO's existence. And one task for the future, for us, not far future now, is to try to do something about this. It's all starting here. They shouldn't be in Afghanistan, and there's no reason why it should be anywhere. Well, that's a little bit of one piece of the story. AFPAC, it's of course much worse. I mean, the Bush administration did institute plans to establish it's called an anti-missile system in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia, and Poland. The reason it was given for that was to protect Europe against Iranian nuclear-armed missiles. The slight problem is that they don't exist. Another problem is that it's inconceivable that if they had them, that Iran would ever use them unless the ruling mullahs have a kind of a death wish. I mean, if Iran even tried to arm a missile, the country would be vaporized. Aside from that, the defense system in Czechoslovakia and Poland is not the place to block Iranian missiles. You put it to the south, as in fact Putin suggested and was dismissed. The only possible interpretation of the missile system is a threat against the Russian deterrent, which means it's a first strike weapon. And in fact, it's understood on all sides that that's what missile defense is, if it ever works, which is unlikely. That what it might do, conceivably, is reduce, contain a retaliatory strike, never contain a first strike. And as I say, that's recognized on all sides. And it's described in the strategic analysis literature and by hawkish congressmen and others as just a first strike weapon. It's a weapon that says we can strike you with impunity because you won't be able to strike back. And the Russians don't have to read U.S. Strategic arms journals to understand that. I mean, they can if they want. They can read the major arms journals and read analyses by top American analysts, strategic analysts, saying the only possible function of this system is as a threat to the Russian deterrent, hence the first strike weapon. And those are the reasons that they understand that. Well, Clinton's his top East European advisor, Stroke Talbot, who was Undersecretary of State for East European Affairs, he justified the expansion. I mean, this pointed out to him, of course, and everybody understands it. He justified it as saying that it is part of expanding the European Union to the East. But this has nothing to do with the European Union. I mean, there are states that are members of the European Union that aren't members of NATO. Sweden, Finland, Austria. NATO is a military alliance. It has nothing to do with the European Union. So this is a simple expansion of what is intended to become a U.S.-run global intervention force. That's one of the last things the world needs. Other countries are part of this too. So, for example, Israel. One of Israel's roles is to services to the United States. One of the reasons why the U.S. blocks political settlement there is to be a military base for U.S. aggression. That became dramatically obvious, or would have been if it had been reported during the attack on Gaza. Right in the middle of the attack on Gaza, the Pentagon announced that it's sending a big shipment of arms to Israel. Right in the middle of the attack. Not many people seem to care, but there were a couple of questions to the Pentagon. And the Pentagon answered, I'm sure correctly, that these arms aren't intended for the Israeli attack on Gaza. They're to be prepositioned in Israel. So that makes them okay, no further question. They're to be prepositioned for anticipated U.S. aggression in the region. And that's fine. So therefore, nobody objected to that. Since we own the world, we're allowed to bomb it or whatever we want to do to it, unquestioned presupposition. Incidentally, a day or two ago, you probably noticed, or maybe yesterday, that it was announced that Israel had bombed the Sudan during the Gaza war because they claimed that they detected, and killing a lot of people in a truck convoy, they claimed that the intelligence detected that weapons are being sent, theoretically from Iran, to Gaza for the population to use in defense against the Israeli attack. Now, that justification for the bombing was considered quite legitimate. I mean, the commentary said, okay, that's understandable, but natural that they would do that. But for us to send arms to Israel right in the middle of the attack, how can anyone question that? You know? But normal standards apply. Well, that's part of the AFPAC NATO story, more of course, but offers a lot of work to do. It's plain educational work, to get people to understand something about what's happening in the world. Well, what about the other two major Middle East problems that the U.S. has to confront and that Obama's already talked about? One is Iran, the other is Israel-Palestine. Well, these now have been linked. John Kerry, of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, our senator, made a speech, gave a speech to the Brookings Institute a couple of days ago, in which he explained that we have a new possibility for solving the Israel-Palestine problem, which has been such a hard task for us to solve despite all our efforts. The new approach, he said, would be to reconceptualize it so that it's not an Israel-Palestine issue, but a regional issue. Okay, that eliminates the need to settle the problem. It's a regional issue. How is it a regional issue? Well, our goal should be to join with the Arab states. By that he means the dictators who rule them by violence and whose natural friends and associates. So join with the Arab states in an alliance with Israel to confront the real enemy, namely Iran. So we have to reconceptualize the problem. It's now a task of getting a regional alliance which will confront Iran. And he says, goes on to say that up until now, the Arab states were wedded to the famous three no's of Khartoum in 1967. No to peace, no to any dealings with Israel, and so on. Because they're finally breaking out of that. And now they have a new three no's. No to Iran, no to Iranian influence and aggression, and so on. So we have a framework for approaching both problems. Line up the Arab dictators, join in with Israel, we have an alliance against the real evil demon, Iran. He went on to say how this would, how the other developments in the Arab world, he said, now make an Israel-Palestine agreement feasible within this framework. One of them is that, he said, by now the Arab states have gone away from the three no's, and a few years ago the Arab League produced a proposal, the Arab League proposal, originally initiated by Saudi Arabia, which offers, as he put it, a commitment to normalize relations with Israel. Okay, so they can normalize relations with Israel, and then we'll all be happy together. Finally, Israel, which has been desperately seeking a partner for peace, has maybe found one. That's the Arab states are saying, okay, we'll normalize relations with you. Well, that's not what the Arab League proposal said, and that's not. And a lot has happened between 1967 and now, which he wouldn't want to talk about if he even knows about, and isn't noticed by any commentators either, because it's out of history. It reflects too badly on our role in the region, so it's gone. One of the tasks of activists is to bring a little history back. So in between 1967 and 2009 and 2006, when the Arab League proposal was made, there have been major efforts to carry forward what in fact is the Arab League proposal, namely a two-state settlement on the international border with minor and mutual modifications. That's the official U.S. terminology up until 1971, when the U.S. departed from the world on this issue, which I'll mention in a moment. That's the Arab League proposal. In that context, it calls for normalization of relations with Israel. But for Kerry and also for Obama, I'll come back to that, the only part of the proposal that exists is normalized relations with Israel. Well, what's happened in between? Well, for one thing, in 1971, the three no's were gone. Egypt offered a full peace treaty with Israel coast. Nothing for the Palestinians, in fact. Just withdrawal from the Sinai, Egyptian territory. Okay, if that had been accepted, Israel would have no security problems. The Palestinian issue hadn't even arisen in any way that anyone was paying attention to, at least. Egypt is the major military force in the Arab world. Full peace treaty would have ended the security problems. Israel understood this, but they rejected it. They rejected it in favor of expansion. At that time, it was expansion into the northeastern Sinai, where thousands of Bedouins were being forcefully expelled, driven into the desert. Israel was planning to build a major city, a city with 1 million people, seaport, Yamit, and a lot of settlements, Kibbutzim and others in the neighborhood from which the inhabitants were expelled. So they chose expansion into the Sinai over peace, over security. And in fact, that choice has governed Israeli policy from then until now. Security is interesting, but expansion is a much higher value. Well, the crucial question in 1971 was what the U.S. would do, as it always is. And there was an internal struggle in the government between the State Department, William Rogers, who wanted to continue with what had been U.S. policy, namely no acquisition of territory by force. That means a settlement on the pre-June 67 border, the international border, with minor and mutual modifications, meaning straighten out some curved lines from the ceasefire. He proposed to continue with that. Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor, was at that time trying to take over the State Department, so he'd run the whole show. And my opinion is if Rogers had said it's raining, Kissinger would have said, no, the sun's shining. But in any event, since Rogers was in favor of this, Kissinger took the opposite position. His position was what he describes proudly in his memoirs as stalemate, meaning no negotiations, just force. He won out in the bureaucratic competition, and the United States backed Israel's rejection of peace in favor of expansion. And that's what's been the policy ever since, up until this minute. In 1976, the Arab states brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for a two-state settlement. By that time, the Palestinian issue had reached the international agenda, the two-state settlement on the 67 borders, the pre-67 borders, the international border. The U.S. reacted by vetoing it. A U.S. veto, worth bearing in mind, is a double veto. For one thing, it doesn't happen, and for another thing, it's wiped out of history. So try to find a reference for it anywhere, aside from the margins or a few specialists. Same thing happened in 1980, another resolution, under Carter, also vetoed by the United States. And meanwhile, the issue shifted to the General Assembly, where similar resolutions were brought up almost annually. Standard votes were something like 150 to 2, or maybe 151 to 3. Sometimes Dominica, the Marshall Islands, or somebody would join in. But essentially blocked by the U.S. systematically every year. And it goes right up to the president. So let's take not just John Kerry, but President Obama. He has so far made one major foreign policy declaration, namely when he announced the appointment of his Middle East negotiator, George Mitchell. And his speech was interesting. He said, of course, our main concern in the region is the security of Israel. Everything else is secondary. But he said there are constructive moves coming from the Arab side for the first time. And he, like Kerry, mentioned the Arab League peace proposal. There's very constructive elements in it, calls for normalization of relations with Israel, and the Arab states should now proceed to implement that. And adding Kerry's conceptual reconstruction, reorganization, that means join us in this alliance against Iran, the real enemy. Now, Obama is an intelligent person, and he chooses his words carefully. He surely knew that that was not the Arab League proposal. It called for the two-state settlement that the U.S. alone has rejected for over 30 years. And in that context, normalization. So his omission of that is a clear signal that he intends the U.S. to continue with its rejectionist program. There have been very rare departures from this, if you go through them, but rare and temporary. It's been a consistent position. And it's made very clear that it's going to continue. So Kerry, for example, in his speech said that, among other indications, that Israel finally has that partner for peace that it's been desperately yearning for. He said not only the Arab states have said, yes, we want to normalize relations with you, but also the Palestinians are beginning to improve their behavior. And he mentioned one example. The Palestinians have accepted a military force, armed by the U.S., of course, trained by a general, a U.S. general, helped by the Jordanian dictatorship. And that military force has proven that that the Palestinian Authority can finally act responsibly. And he explained how it did that. During the Gaza attack, the U.S.-run security force was able to prevent any expression of sympathy for people in Gaza by the population of the West Bank. So they're doing their job. And that means they're beginning to act responsibly, and maybe we can admit them into the civilized world. He also said that, of course, Israel has to do some things too, not just the Palestinians and the Arabs. He said it has to freeze settlements. What does that mean? Well, all the settlements are criminal. That's not even a question. In fact, Israel was informed by its highest legal authorities back in 1967 that any settlement in the occupied territories is in violation of the Geneva Conventions, the foundation of international humanitarian law. And they recognized it and said, well, yeah, that's what states do, so we're going to do it anyway. That was reiterated a couple of years ago by the World Court, including the U.S. Justice, in a separate declaration, said that, yes, the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories. So when you hear talk about Israel should remove its illegal outposts, that's meaningless. Every person there is there illegally. Every settlement is illegal. And when Kerry says you should freeze the settlements, he's saying continue the criminal activity that is breaking up the West Bank into unviable cantons and making it possible any meaningful Palestinian state. There's another aspect to freezing settlements. And I'm sure Kerry doesn't know, his analysts do. In fact, you can read about it in a new report of B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, that just came out a couple of days ago. One of the ways in which you freeze settlements is by expanding. So put a ring around them, which takes in Palestinian land, often private land, and just keeping it, pushing it, I call it a security barrier, then you can do anything, and push it outward. And of course you have what's called natural growth. So maybe natural growth between, and a settlement turns into a city or something. So that's Kerry's recommendation for the U.S. and Israel. He, of course, insists that the U.S. must not deal with Hamas. They committed a crime too. They won a democratic election, and that's not permitted. In fact, as soon as there's the only free election in the Arab world, really, Palestine, January 2006, they won the election. They weren't supposed to. So instantly, the U.S. initiated a policy to punish the Palestinians for voting the wrong way. Not the first time. And this went on right alongside the rhetoric about our love for democracy, Bush's democracy agenda, and so on and so forth. The U.S. and Israel, of course, initiated a program to punish the Palestinians, a serious program. For example, the U.S. blocked the European Union effort to send medical supplies and pencils and things to Gaza because maybe they'd be used by Hamas. Who knows? It's kind of like the Israeli prohibitions today. They don't allow macaroni and toilet paper in because you could make bombs with them. So that even elicited a brief comment from Hillary Clinton, but it continues to support them. So we can't deal with them. And of course, as always, there's a pretext. The pretext is that Hamas doesn't accept three conditions that we impose. One, they have to recognize Israel. Two, they have to renounce violence. And three, they have to accept previous agreements, particularly the famous roadmap. I mean, the fact that he can say that, anybody can say that, without the press corps collapsing in ridicule, is pretty impressive. Does the U.S. accept those three conditions? Does Israel accept it? Have the U.S. and Israel renounced violence? Do they recognize Palestine? Did they live up to past agreements, like, say, the roadmap? In fact, Israel immediately announced, when the roadmap appeared, that it wasn't going to accept it. The way they did it is by saying, yeah, we accept it, it's wonderful, we have 14 reservations, which completely eviscerated. I think one of the merits of Jimmy Carter's book is that for the first time he broke the silence on that. I noticed no reviewer ever mentioned it, but that was the one novel contribution within the mainstream in his book. He actually had an appendix in which he gave the 14 reservations, which the U.S. approved of. which ends that agreement. And of course, Kerry says free settlement. That's another one. So that's how we're going to solve the Israel-Palestine problem. Namely, shift it to, put it to the side, continue our blocking of a political settlement. Yeah. Warnings here. I should mention in this connection, I'll go on to the last thing, that the political settlement is accepted by the entire world. I mean, Europe, the non-aligned countries, Hamas accepted it for years, Hezbollah, Iran has said they accepted. Just the U.S. and Israel blocking it again, constantly. Obama, the same. Kerry, the same. The media can't talk about it, or maybe don't know. More work to be done. Well, what about Iran? Kerry also talked about Iran. He said, we can't take force off the table. Of course, we want to negotiate, we're friendly and so on, but one of the options is force. It seems to bother nobody that the threat of force is explicitly in violation of the foundations of international law, violation of the UN Charter, which bars the threat or use of force in international affairs. But we're above the law, so that doesn't matter. Obama, too. Obama is supposed to have reached out his hand in friendship to Iran a couple of days ago with his New Year's message. What did he say, actually? He said, well, we're going to be happy to talk to you, but you have to meet some responsibilities. You have to give up arms and violence. And again, how can anybody hear that and not collapse in ridicule? I mean, Iran has to give up arms and violence. Whose military budget equals that of the rest of the world combined? It's not Iran. Who carries out aggression regularly, in fact, right on the borders of Iran? In fact, when was Iran last guilty of the use of violence? So it doesn't matter. It passes. More work for us to do. Joe Biden, the vice president, amplified this. He said that we'll be willing to deal with Iran if it accepts our conditions in advance of negotiations, namely stop its uranium enrichment. He said it must stop its illicit nuclear programs. Why? And of course, end terror. What are its illicit nuclear programs? You know, I mean, there was certainly uranium enrichment is not illicit. In fact, that's the height of any signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it must be that they have a weapons program. Well, there was a national intelligence estimate in November 2007, which concluded after long deliberation that they don't have a weapons program and haven't had it for years. Obama responded to that. He said, yes, that was what intelligence decided. We reject it. He also said, we don't have any new evidence. His administration said, we don't have any new evidence, we don't like it, so reject it. So therefore, whatever they're doing is illicit. As far as terror is concerned, ugly regime, no doubt there's plenty of terror, but what the U.S. is pointing to is their efforts alleged efforts, probably true, to assist Hezbollah and Hamas to defend themselves against a U.S.-Israeli attack. That's terror in our lexicon. So nobody is allowed to defend themselves against our force or the force of our clients. So that's terror, again, accepted. What does the world think about this? Well, what you read is that constantly is that the international community has demanded that Iran stop uranium enrichment. Who exactly is the international community? Well, what about the majority of states in the world, which are the non-aligned movement? Well, they forcefully, insistently support Iran's right to enrich uranium as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they're not part of the international community. What about the American population? A large majority of them agree with the non-aligned movement. Probably 75% say, sure, Iran has this right. So the American population is not part of the international community. In fact, what the international community is, and this is a term that's almost always used, is Washington and whoever happens to agree with it at that moment. So, yeah, they demand that Iran stop any kind of uranium enrichment, because we say, though our intelligence estimate says the opposite, that they're doing it for weapons production. An American opinion here, and this is kind of important for activists, is quite interesting in other respects. I mean, a large majority of Americans, like 75-80%, think the United States ought to live up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That means eliminate its nuclear weapons. And a corresponding majority, roughly 75-80%, advocate a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. That means Iran, Israel, and any U.S. forces deployed there. Okay, whatever problem there may be could be mitigated and probably overcome by moves in that direction. But that's not an electoral option. It's only the public that wants that. Well, so I'll stop. All of this, without elaborating, gives plenty of work for activists who want to become engaged in these issues. There's a lot to say about domestic and financial issues, but I think Bill's going to talk about that, so I'll stop.